Welcome to this lecture of Introduction to American Government, where we will discuss federalism, which according to this 1949 cartoon is all about states governments accepting federal benefits and resisting federal authority. Now, the concept of federalism serves the principle of separation of powers by creating another level of authority in the United States of America between citizens and the federal government, and providing thus another source of potentially solving problems of politics. It was a compromise between anti-federalists and federalists. The anti-federalists were very much supportive of state sovereignty. The Federalists were opposed to it, and it was partly driven by the reality of state attachment in the 18th and 19th century. Compared to today, most Americans in the past primarily were attached and identified with their state locality rather than the United States as a whole, as an abstract idea. So federalism made sense by recognizing and trying to take advantage of that reality. Now, in the Constitution, the federal equals national government is equated with enumerated powers of Congress, Article 1, Section 8. And the most important clause here that provides for the supremacy of the federal government is the necessary and proper clause, which permits Congress to take all necessary and proper actions to implement the legislature. And then in Article 4, you even have it very clearly where the Constitution and the laws made in accordance to it, plus international treaties, are the supreme law of the land. So the United States of America is a federal state. The states that are members of it are not sovereign entities. They do not have the powers that internationally recognized states have. And their legal systems and laws are inferior and under the oversight of the federal government. What about the states? What do they get out of this? Well, under the 10th Amendment, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Now, do remember the necessary and proper clause is superior to the 10th Amendment in practice, and Article 1, Section 10 takes away from states a lot of the powers they had under the Articles of Confederation. That said, they have concurrent powers that are shared by both the federal and the state governments. Now, one important thing with the 10th Amendment is that it tells us that if you follow the natural law tradition, legal tradition, it tells us where we will discover new rights. And essentially, new rights will be discovered either directly by the people as a population of citizens who will then push for Congress to legally recognize the rights, or they can be done at the state level. But essentially, it's not a job of the federal government in a way to find new rights, so that will depend on how the Supreme Court interprets the word the people. So states have some powers that are exclusive to them. States have powers that they share with the federal government. But they have none of the powers that we associate with legal sovereignty in the international system. They can't fight wars, for example. They cannot actually send it, they cannot accept and send ambassadors and so on. And of course, there are many who think that the Constitution actually limits the federal government more than what I told you. It's okay to have those thoughts, but the reality is that the necessary and proper clause and the supremacy clause in Article 4 really do make the U.S. Constitution and the federal government superior to the states. Okay? But there are many who disagree with this. Well, good luck persuading the Supreme Court about it. That's the organization that will resolve this.
You know, the role of government in our lives is very important, whether we like it or not. Government in a free society is the ultimate contract, an agreement between the government and those being governed. At the heart of the deal is freedom. One of the keys to freedom is keeping a powerful federal government within its proper boundaries. Our Constitution does that. That's what checks and balances are all about. Also, the 10th Amendment provides that after delineated powers are given to the federal government, all other powers are reserved for the states and for the people. The courts and Congress often lose sight of this provision. The movement today is to nationalize every cause that's deemed worthy. Education, health care, criminal laws, tort laws, the list goes on. The problem is, this not only places too much power in the hands of Washington bureaucrats and federal courts, it deprives us of the main benefits provided by our system of federalism. Having 50 state laboratories for policy ideas and experiments to see what works and doesn't work in government. There's also the benefit of having 50 states in competition with each other, trying to attract people, businesses, and recognition for policy innovations and achievements. This thing we call federalism results in better services for our citizens, greater accountability on the part of elected officials, and the diffusion of governmental power, just as our founders envisioned. So the next time you hear that there ought to be a law to deal with a particular problem, ask yourself two questions. Is this really a problem that government should be involved in? And if so, what level of government should be involved? Federal, state, or local? There are some pretty compelling reasons not to automatically look to the federal government first.
Now, when it comes to the powers, here are some examples of exclusive federal, concurrent, and exclusive state rights. For example, international military force waging war is the exclusive right of the federal government. I mean, Congress is the only institution that can declare war in the United States American system. Presidents have avoided that. Well, they have avoided that because Congress lets them avoid that, okay? And when it comes to taxes, guess what? Both the federal government and state governments can tax you. Here in Nevada, we are lucky. Our state does not have income taxes, but in most other states, you get income taxes, and you also have to pay various taxes on vehicles, whether you're in Nevada or not. And finally, the running of elections has pretty much been an exclusive state authority, overseen by the federal government, but it's pretty much states that run elections. It has historically permitted states to, restrict the franchise in ways that the anti-federal government found to be illegal. Now, what happens when states and the national government collide? They cannot agree which power belongs to them and which power belongs to the federal government. Well, guess who? The Supreme Court resolves it. So it goes up to the federal judiciary to resolve this issue. And many times the federal judiciary takes the sides of states, and many times it takes the sides of the federal government. But on the bigger question of supremacy, it has always almost taken the side of the federal government, declaring that the US Constitution is supreme to state laws. And this was especially done with the nullification crisis before the Civil War, when some southern states essentially claimed the right to nullify, in other words, to refuse legally to implement federal laws, which would have made them, of course, sovereign if they had that power, and made the United States of America a confederation rather than a federation. To those questions of authority, we also have competing philosophical views about federalism. Some people argue for marble cake federalism, or called cooperative federalism, which is based on a pragmatic mixing of authority and progress among the national, state, and local governments. In such a system, you will have much more concurrent powers, with only very few powers being left either to the federal government or the state governments. Others, on the other hand, argue for layer cake federalism, which is based on a clear delineation of authority and programs among the levels of government, or go dual federalism. In this case, there will be very few concurrent powers, and most powers will either be exclusively federal or exclusively state. This is philosophical views. In some ways, the United States is like a marble cake federalism. In some ways, it is a layer cake federalism. You actually don't get to hear a lot of it as citizens, because politicians don't think this sells, and they rather resolve it without having to do recuse to the people. But it is a debate out there that you might want to be aware of, and you might want to have your own position on this. The framers of the Constitution could have chosen alternatives to federalism. They could have made a unitary system like France, where Macron, c'est la bosse. In France, lower levels of government, municipalities, prefectures, and so on, are totally dependent on the central government for everything. They have no exclusive local powers. and the central government not only oversees what is done, but ultimately also controls what is done. So localities have, like, they might have their own identity, but they have no political power that is independent of the central government. Or you could have a confederal system if libertarians and people who are against the federal system in the United States get the way, and they don't completely destroy the union into many independent states that then will fight each other, with California and Texas pretty much dominating most of the North American landmass. You could get a confederal system, like the old Article of Confederation. And today, the biggest and most well-known and potentially successful confederal system is the European Union. In the European Union, every state is sovereign. They can ultimately refuse the decisions made by the European Commission. They can even refuse to pay fines and stuff. They have the sovereign authority. So, you know, they're sovereign, but they cooperate in a confederal structure. But all of the powers of the EU are totally determined by the European Council, where the European Council is essentially made up by the heads of states and governments of all those states, and where there is veto power. So every single country in the EU can veto any decisions made by anybody, any majority in it. That is the essence of confederalism. You are still a sovereign state. You just have some concurrent powers between states rather than between the European Union and the states. Or we could just join the Klingon Empire, an asymmetrical type of state where a center essentially controls a periphery that has a lot of autonomy, but is ultimately existing at the tolerance of the center, which essentially exploits the periphery fully.
Klingon wohkan mach. La wamach chanuga hotai, et sachvam sig judge la hochka. Yuk da sig a, chai a, kapigos, chamu. Kagak bej Klingon yok tlupu woh chiu hoch. Mi bej tik, tai kek. Okan. Edge majka yisma. Klingon maj yenicheri la wigach my wheat yok. Tepinge yok dakbo mut. Edge la neng yongkach lo wok. Hevel pok yukwan wok kling sigach je ragach kelkik got chitui pach dakvajai. Nu homlich rochgach, timke pos mochgach, je yabje Klingon woch mov sibbe. Su ach achar. Ruv bos sibi a.
Now the question is, what's so great about federal system? Well, first of all, you have competition among states as laboratories of democracy. Each state can try to make some changes in its political economic system and see what works. As long as those changes do not violate the Republican character clause of the Constitution and bring on the wrath of Congress, you get a lot of liberty in creating very different political systems and economic systems from state to state. California, for example, has a very different economic system than Nebraska, and so on. So to be fair, Americans haven't really explored this a lot. Like, you know, you would expect some states to maybe go to a sortition system, those that are more for radical participatory democracy. But most of them simply copy-paste the whole 3 separate branches of government, bicameral legislation. Thank God for Nebraska with its unicameral legislature, and so on. More importantly is that you have multiple institutions to find redress. You're thus less likely as a citizen to face the choice of fight or submit. You can try to find redress in the state governments or the federal government. And finally, you have a better representation of different political views and lifestyles, something that makes sense with the diversity of religious, social, and political ideologies within the United States of America. The eastern states are definitely very different than the southern states, for example. Nevada is very different from Illinois, and Nevada then is very different from Utah right next door, or California right next door. Okay, remember, this class is not a class about American United States history, okay? If you want to go more into the history of federalism, take the classes of Dr. Jonathan Parker or Dr. Ethan Hawkley. But very briefly, the ideas about federalism have varied over the history of the United States of America. Now, initially, there were two key decisions made by the Marshall Court. Yes, that Marshall, the one who gave us the power of constitutional review. Well, he also gave something back to the federal government with two decisions, McCulloch versus Maryland and Gibson versus Ogden. You can read the decisions down in the comment section. They pretty much established the supremacy of the federal government over state governments, especially when it came to those commercial things that were considered to be under the authority of the federal government. But this attitude of supremacy was kind of checked a bit by the more general classical liberal attitude that tended to see state governments as the better solution for problems before you went to the federal system. This collapsed with the states' rights movement, which essentially drove a nullification argument under which states will have the right to nullify decisions on the United States of government, becoming thus essentially sovereign. The Supreme Court and the federal government reacted to that. The crisis essentially metastasized to the crisis of the United States Civil War, which was centered, among other issues, the most important of which was slavery, also on questions of state sovereignty, called state rights, but it was really state sovereignty. Nullification pretty much will turn the United States of America into a confederation rather than a federation. With the U.S. Civil War, that was resolved by blood. States did not have the right to secede. They thus were not sovereign entities. Sovereign states have the right to leave any organization and treaty they are parts of at any time, under the rebus sextantibus and pacta cum servanda principles of international law. So U.S. states were not sovereign, they were inferior to the federal government. As time passed, and especially with the rise of Jim Crow, again we saw the federal government retreating and giving states much more freedom, especially the southern states. This came to an end with two things. First of all, the 1930s great crisis, the great crash, and FDR's policies, which saw an increase in the power of the federal government. In many cases, the states themselves supported that because they got more money in return for that. And then we are in the modern world with the civil rights movement that put another nail on the death, on the coffin of the old ideas of state sovereignty or state autonomy within the United States of America. Since the 1970s, the Supreme Court got worried by the supremacy of the federal government over states and tried to pass some decisions that will devolve more powers back to states, take them from being concurrent and put them to exclusive to the states. This was ended by the September 9/11 attacks and the economic crisis from 2008 and after, and also because of the incentives for the federal Congress to meddle with states. There are three reasons why they do that. First of all, national issues demand national solutions, which is their job. So they have an incentive to declare an issue a national emergency, because then they can legitimate their interference and activity rather than the activity of state governments. Makes them good at elections. Remember, congresspersons represent states or constitutions within states, so it's better if they get to take care of an issue rather than their lesser colleagues in state capitals. And three, they sometimes want to preempt state action. They want to make sure the federal government has a solution before states try something of their own, which might be something tricky or something that undermines the prestige of Congress and the federal government. Now, how does Congress get states to play along with their national legislative agenda? Well, there are essentially four ways to do it, and it depends on whether Congress makes money available to support the program, in another name, whether they fund it or not, and whether they provide detailed instructions, putting very little freedom to states when it comes to administrating in a program, or no detailed instructions, essentially letting states do whatever they want. If you have funding and detailed instructions, you have the most powerful way Congress can force states to play along. These are categorical grants like Medicaid, food stamp program, and the interstate highway system. Congress gives no leeway to states, but also tells them, here's money, do what we tell you to do. If you have detailed instructions and no funding, then you have unfunded mandates like No Child Left Behind, and pretty much states ignore them. They might do them if they want for their own political reasons, but they pretty much ignore them because they don't like the detailed instructions. They feel like a straitjacket, and the federal government is not giving them any money to obey. So why will they do that? If you have no detailed instructions and you have funding, that is the favorite thing of all state governments, because that means you get money for free and you can do whatever you want with that. That's called block grants like TANF. And if you have no detailed instructions and no funding, then the federal government has no influence, like in the case of the death penalty. States do whatever they want. The final point I want to make is that opposition to federal intrusion really depends on whether one controls the federal government or no. When conservatives control the federal government, liberals cry for states' rights and state autonomy. When liberals control the federal government, conservatives cry for state rights and state autonomy. In another name, federalism and the ideologies around it are pretty much another toy in the political playground that is the American federal government. And very few people are actually consistent, especially actual politicians and activists, are actually consistent in their beliefs about federalism or, giving more power to the states or more power to the federal government. They usually are not mainstream. They're usually in fringe parties. They usually have no power to the agenda. Those who have power to influence politics, they see this pragmatically, changing depending on circumstances. And that's the lecture about federalism. To understand some of the differences between the federal government and other types of government, let's compare what we learned with the unitary state, in which case it's the state of Nevada and its relation to local government. Now, local governments in the United States are creations of state governments, and in Nevada, city and county governments are covered by Articles 4, 8, 9, 10, 13, and 15 of the Nevada Constitution. Pretty much until recently, those local governments were pretty much under a lot of control of the legislature. But since 2015, counties were given by the legislative department functional home rule, a limited form of autonomy. Separation of powers at the local level is rare, as they're not considered to be actually real governments since they are not autonomous. And it's considered more important that separation of powers lies where true power lies, in which case it's the state government and state institutions. Of course, for many of the people living in counties and towns and cities, that is the actual government with which they interact. So interestingly, we let that be unitary with no separation of powers. The most expansive form of local government are the counties. There are 17 counties, and they can only be abolished by vote of the residents. They are run by boards of county commissioners that are established by the legislature. Members are elected for 4-year terms, and the county department heads are also elected. This makes it very hard for boards of county commissioners to control what the department heads do, since they don't actually own their job to the county commission. So you have an issue of potential divided government over there. Counties also include subordinate townships, about 43 of them. And you can learn the counties and see where they are on the map of the state by looking at this map. But there's Carson City, Churchill, Clark, Douglas, Elko, Esmeralda, Eureka, Story, White Pine, Humboldt, Lander, Lincoln, Lyon, Mineral, Nye, Pershing, and Washoe counties. You also have city governments. They are covered by Article 8 of the Constitution about municipal corporations. They can either be of general or special charter. General charters are drawn by the legislator. Special charters have to be approved by the legislator. They're governed by city councils, which are elected in nonpartisan elections, and those have a lot of freedom into setting up the way that the city government is structured and operates. Some of them appoint mayors, some of them have them being elected from the people. Unlike counties, city governments have that freedom. And the department heads are appointed by the mayor and not elected. So it's much less likely you're going to have divided government at the city level. You can see a list of the incorporated cities in Nevada, with those in bold being with special charters. We got Boulder City, Caliente, Carlin, Elko, Ely, Fallon, Fairleigh, Henderson, Las Vegas, Lovelock, Mesquite, North Las Vegas, Reno, Sparks, Wells, West Wendover, Winnemucca or Winnemucca, and Yerington. You can correct me about that. Finally, all other elements of subordinate character of the 17 school districts under the Board of Education, which includes 7 voting members, 3 appointed by the governor, and 7 non-voting members, all appointed by the government. The Board of Regents, that controls me and your education at the higher level, controlled by 13 elected members, and the special district governments, which are specific government things that are created for a specific single mission or task, like firefighting and so on. The important thing to understand is all of these are subordinate to the legislator of Nevada, which can create and abolish them at will, which is not the case with states of the United States of America. Except from counties, as we said, we have to be abolished by a vote of their members. So the legislator can create new counties.